is a scale that Kathy Hurt, who is an accounting professor at Baylor University. I met Kathy when she was on faculty at the University of Wisconsin when I was there doing my doctoral studies. And Kathy did her dissertation on professional skepticism. And so as a part of her dissertation, she developed a scale which measures basically how skeptical you are. So there's no right or wrong answer. So I didn't want you, that's why it was important for you to think about it from the perspective of yourself and not what you think an auditor would do, right? And so Kathy, her scale has been widely used in audit research, looking at running experiments, looking at how auditors behave in certain situations and measures their trait skepticism. So that's what this scale does, is it measures as a trait how skeptical are you. So the higher the scores, the more skeptical you are. And so Kathy also wanted to determine whether or not this applies for auditors, right? So she ran, using her scale, she ran an experiment with auditors, and people have subsequently done the same thing, using audit professionals, first giving them the scale to measure their skepticism. And it doesn't say to them, oh, it's a measure of your skepticism. This is just, we're interested in how you approach situations or something to that effect, right? And so she ran this, and what she found, and then she put the auditors in a task where they had to make some judgment about something, whether it, and I can't remember the experiment exactly, but whether it is how likely are they to identify errors in information that's presented to them, and then what action would they take if they identified those areas. And what she found, and I'm summarizing at such a high level, she found that those auditors that were skeptical, exhibited a higher level of skepticism, were more likely to identify more errors, find the seeded errors, and they were more likely to act on it in terms of adjust their audit approach to address those errors than auditors who were less skeptical. Right? So she found, as a result of that, and subsequent research has found the same thing, that skepticism does have an impact on how auditors approach resolving issues, like auditing and accounting issues. So it's a good way to kind of measure and use it in terms of training and development how people approach situations, or to point out the importance of being skeptical. So this is not a test, it's for you to keep just to, I don't need to know your answers, but how skeptical you are. Some of us are trait, and again, remember, it's your trait skepticism. So some of us are just skeptical by nature. And maybe, and I have no clue about this, and I don't know if anyone's ever done a study, but maybe auditors in general, that people who select to go into the field of auditing, maybe they're just skeptical by nature. And there are other professions that you can see that. What do you think? What are some other professions that you think? A lawyer. Attorney. Any other? Prosecutor. Doctors. Law enforcement. Right? You go into law enforcement.
Maybe like psychologists, since there's a lot of them are the ones that actually form these different models.
Oh, psychologists. Okay, yeah. Because think about what we say with accounting, right? Trust but verify. Right? You trust what people say and you verify. How many of you ask a lot of questions? The first time you meet someone or you encounter a situation, how many of you ask a lot of questions? Aaron? Awesome. What do people say to you?
Nosy.
Nosy. Right. Now, so people who don't ask a lot of questions, why don't you ask a lot of questions? Would you consider yourself skeptical? No? How many people considered themselves skeptical before they even heard of the term professional skepticism or took this little test? Okay. So what characteristic did you demonstrate that made you feel like you were skeptical? Like, what would you say
That I
is your...
don't take things at face value. I want to know like reason behind it.
I met skepticism as part of the philosophy in my high school class, like in Croatia, and that's when I started I was a church girl, and that's when I started like asking questions. I was starting to be like more skeptical. Is this true? Can you prove it? Like that's when the whole thing went down.
Oh, they kicked you out of church.
They just didn't like, there's a lot of people, at least in Croatia, they don't like questions, like, because a lot of things can be explained, so. That's
But you have to have a lot of belief, right, in religion.
Yeah, that's when I got
you have
like
to
very
believe in the things
disappointed.
not seen.
Yes.
Right? Which could be hard for a skeptical person. Like,
I know.
but most of us don't ask these questions in church, so.
Yeah.
When people tell me something or they explain something to me, I often look for holes or inconsistencies in what they're saying. And then if I don't find anything,
So you'd be a
I'm
good
like,
cop.
Yeah. But like, no.
Yeah. What else? Anybody else? Any other ideas? Characteristics that you have in yourself?
It just in basic social settings, whenever people are talking, I don't really vocalize my questions as much, but I keep all my questions in my head, questioning what they're saying and comparing it to what they said like maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
That's how I am. Right? I'm skeptical. I was skeptical before I even knew what an audit was. It's just my nature. I'm skeptical by nature. Except when I went to church, I wasn't skeptical. And I'm the same way. So I tend not to ask a lot of questions unless I'm in a work situation where I have to. But if I'm kind of sitting back, I observe. Right? I observe and I'm listening to what they're saying, because a part of it is having to listen, right, to what people are saying. Listen and observe their behavior, compare it against like, does that make sense, or why would you do that, or something like that. So being skeptical, yes, you might not verbally ask a lot of questions, but you tend to challenge things, not out of just being annoying, but because does it make sense? Does it pass your own internal smell test, right? Does it make sense to you? So some of us verbalize that by asking a lot of questions, and some of us, we're questioning it, inherently. We're just questioning things, and maybe at some point we will ask questions, but we're going to try to kind of play it over in our mind and identify those inconsistencies or things that we think are inconsistent or that just doesn't make sense. Whereas my husband is by trade a cop. Like he was a police officer for the majority of his career. So he asks a lot of questions. And it annoys the heck out of him. Like, why are you asking me all of these questions? Like, what is the problem? But it's his nature. And he knew he wanted to be a cop since I knew him. Right? Since we were kids, he wanted to be a cop. And he just self-selected right into that career because he questions everything. Like, we're watching TV, I'm like, oh my God, it's a television show. Could you stop already? It's a television show. Stop asking them, stop analyzing it, right? But that's his nature. So he chose a profession that kind of fits with his nature. And I think that trait skepticism that we have, I think do kind of tend to lead us into careers or that that we might be, that kind of highlights that aspect of our personality. And so, does it mean that you can't ever be skeptical? Like, if let's say you weren't highly skeptical, right? Do you think you can't be highly skeptical in certain contexts? Like, so for example, what I'm getting at is, can skepticism be learned? What do you think? Yes, no?
Yeah. To some extent. To some extent.
To some extent.
Yes. Because if you're by nature very foolish and you tend to believe people, then I don't know how skeptical can you be? Can you learn to be? Because sometimes people lie, and like if somebody who is I would just know they're lying to my face, but some people just believe it. But I can't get over the fact that how can you believe it? It's like you just know it's a lie. It stinks.
There's some of that going on right now. Some people will believe, even though in the face of facts, right, people will believe, because and whatever that reason is, they might look for the good in people.
Yes.
Or they just don't like, it's like, well, that's just not,
yes.
right. So it's possible that, even people could look at evidence and just kind of look the other way, right, or interpret it differently. And so, in terms of the question, right, so let me, Jasmine and Brandon, what we just did that's a skepticism scale, and everyone took it. It's for you don't have to tell me it's skeptical, right? And so, but you can, right? So what audit firms try to do, right, is put their audit, so they don't assume people are skeptical or not skeptical. They just put them in positions to train them and say, here's some of the things, right, that you should be mindful of. Here's what, in terms of your judgments, what you should be skeptical, that these are things, how you demonstrate skepticism. So you can train people, right, to demonstrate or to engage in skeptical behavior. Right? And so some people are more skeptical in certain contexts than they are, right? It also depends on who we are interacting with. And we might not be as skeptical of a loved one or a close family member. Then we might be more skeptical because we're not believing of everything of a stranger, of what someone tells us. So imagine if you're in a situation with your client where you have a good relationship with your client, you have good rapport with your client, right? And then, so maybe your skepticism guard goes down a little bit. And so training people to be mindful of what skepticism looks like. So what Kathy tried to capture in this scale, the skepticism scale, are these characteristics of skepticism, these 6 characteristics of skepticism. So the first one being a questioning mind, and that makes sense, right? People figure that if you ask a lot of questions, that you must be skeptical. Well, I would suggest that, yeah, you could ask a lot of questions, but if you're asking a lot of meaningless questions, that doesn't mean you're skeptical, right? You want to ask questions to get at what's relevant. You want to ask relevant questions. So a questioning mind, a disposition to inquiry with some sense of doubt. Right? You're not just asking the question to be asking the question because you just want to know, or because, like you just said, somebody said nosy, right? There's a reason you're asking those questions. Suspension of judgment. Remember we talked about that when we talked about the judgment framework. Withhold judgment until appropriate evidence is obtained. Right? Don't rush to solve. Search for knowledge. A desire to investigate beyond the obvious with a desire to corroborate. You want to, think about some of the questions that are on the skepticism scale. Well, learning. I enjoy learning. Interpersonal understanding. Recognitions that people's motivations and perceptions can lead them to provide biased or misleading information. So one of the things that we're going to talk about in the upcoming weeks is inherent risk. And one of the risk factors that we look at when we talk about inherent risk is that auditors, you have to stop and ask yourself, are there situations that the client would have incentives to manage earnings? So we look, okay, their compensation is tied to the performance of the company. They have stock options. So they have some stake in the company beyond just a paycheck, right? So we ask those questions and we look at the information from that perspective. So not assuming that, so even if I said, hey, Jerry's a really nice guy. I've been working with him for the last 7 years, and he's a good church-going family person. But that doesn't erase that he has options in the company. The company's performance is tied to how well he does. Now I can say, I hope Jerry wouldn't do that, but the reality is I have to look at those factors and say, well, that doesn't create an incentive. Not that he did it, but the incentive is still there. So understanding people's motivations or recognizing that people have motivations and perceptions. Autonomy, right? It's the self-direction, the moral independence, the conviction to decide for oneself rather than accepting the claims of others. And that goes a little bit to what our mom was saying. People know that they're lying, right? Right? So think about professional ethics, which we'll talk about next week, right? Ethics. That's an important aspect of our role as accountants and as CPAs and auditors. And so that guides us. And when we talk about ethics, we'll talk, there's some part of ethics that's just your trait. That has nothing to do with the profession. That's about your upbringing, your religious beliefs, right? Your cultural beliefs, what you're grounded in as a person, that what forms you, right? That has nothing to do with the profession. And that is going to impact how you approach situations. Self-esteem, the self-confidence to resist persuasion and to challenge assumptions or conclusions. Like that you're confident enough in your abilities, right? That you're confident enough in yourself, that you're not going to be pressured because, remember that whole thing, groupthink or motivated reason, that you're going to be motivated to reason with the client because of your own personal symptoms, or groupthink because you don't want to be the one that makes the team stand after 2 hours at the end of a long day. Right? That's having enough confidence to be able to act on your beliefs or your findings. So with those characteristics in mind, the questions on the scale are meant to address those 6 characteristics of skepticism. So, with that said, what is professional skepticism? Because all of those things it's not so much about professional skepticism, it's skepticism. Right? As I said, the scale addresses trait skepticism. So, professional skepticism, again, is a mindset. Because you really can't measure objectively whether or not an auditor has demonstrated professional skepticism. What you could do is look at the outcome of their action